Okay, now that we're at the start of a new week, I wanted to start something that was focusing on a director. I wasn't sure who for a while. And while we are going to have focus on specific directors a little bit throughout this month, I wanted to just kind of devote a whole week to just one particular director. And it seemed pretty obvious once it occurred to me that I wanted to do Wes Craven, not just because of, the stuff we haven't talked about yet, that's really big, like this one and others, but the fact that he also has at least a handful of movies in his filmography that I feel like are not very popular and certainly don't have the level of fame that his other movies do, and to kind of talk about all of them sort of here together, a movie a day is kind of what we're mainly focusing on. Some others might come into it, like we might do a little bit of comparison here and there. There's quite a bit of Craven that we've already talked about. We did a Nightmare on Elm Street series video way back when we first started this channel, like a decade ago. That we talked about the first movie, we talked about New Nightmare. Me and my brother did a whole video on the Scream series early last year. Last Us on the Left has come up before, and there's a video on it, and Red Eye a couple years ago we talked about. I obviously wanted to stick closer to his horror. Obviously, he doesn't really go much outside of horror, but all the ones that we're going to talk about are going to be horror. We're not going to talk about everything that he's done. There'll be a few that are left out because we're doing the whole 7 days thing. And he also did some TV movies that we won't quite be completely diving into, but maybe I possibly selected one to do as kind of like a bonus thing, as one video next week after we've done the 7 days thing, so I think that's what we're going to do here. Where I want to start is The Hills Have Eyes, and I guess it's worth noting, even though this was, it went, The Last Us on the Left to this, I believe, for a reason we'll get into later this week, these aren't going to be in a particular order. Like, the ones that we are going to be focusing on are not going to be like in order of release or anything. We're going to jump around a little bit. But, I did want to start with The Hills Have Eyes, which was, for a while there, it kind of seemed like it may have gotten sidelined as, it was certainly a title that everybody knows, and I feel like the remake coming out probably brought it back into the spotlight a little bit, but it was obviously talked about in the circles of people that, the horror genre itself is beloved in and that he's beloved in, but as far as, wide audiences, it does kind of feel like it went into sort of cult territory, and it wasn't going to be mentioned as much as, Nightmare on Elm Street or the Scream series or whatever. But, obviously it has its standing, not even just horror history, but it kind of feels like film history when you really look at it. And the production itself and how that was handled, and what was going on, particularly in the genre at this time, where this was in, the Texas Chainsaw area, but it predates Halloween by a year, so we were in a really interesting sort of jumping off point for what horror was starting to become as, the mid to late 70s kind of pushed it in a new direction, in a more sort of kind of visceral direction, with a lot of kind of leaving monsters behind and going more into stuff that might still feel like monster stories, but bringing a lot of groundedness to them to where they kind of feel like they're in a certain reality that we can recognize. Even if it does reach over the top at some point, but that's especially going to come into play with The Hills Have Eyes, where there's a lot of surprise. Like, when you just hear the title, it sounds like it'd be a kind of monster movie, but one of the main sort of horror points of this movie is how scarily real it feels like it could be. Because we talked a couple years ago, or a few years ago, we talked about Wrong Turn and Wolf Creek together, and I talked with those about our characters are in a place where they're clearly not supposed to be, and there's that very familiar feeling, that very real human feeling of when you feel like you're in a place that you really don't belong and you really probably shouldn't be. The scary nature that comes with that, and sort of being, whether it be you're in a place that's inhabitable, like the middle of the desert, the middle of nowhere or something, or maybe there's a community in this area that feels like it's closing in on you, and you're like the outcast and the outsider that they want out. But also the idea of feeling sort of abandoned, and in a place you shouldn't be. It also feels like this was an early example of the ominous gas station kind of trope that was going on. I'm not entirely sure where the ominous gas station started. I do know, obviously we just mentioned that Texas Chainsaw predates this, and it's also worth noting that this movie has the same production designer as Texas Chainsaw, which is very clear, and that's another movie also where it feels like, I guess, when we've talked before about Texas Chainsaw, I've talked about how it kind of has, the opening scenes kind of have this almost documentary feel, where there might as well be an unseen character that's just holding a regular video camera, and that's what we're seeing the movie through. And this kind of somewhat has that same vibe, where the characters don't necessarily just feel like horror movie characters. They do have a symbolic purpose here, as we'll go further into that also, about what's kind of supposedly being represented here, potentially being represented here, as far as the whole allegory of where the family's coming from and how they come in and they're like this well-off family, and this, maybe not like a rich family, but they're the representation of the rich compared to the poor, which would be what the family of cannibals kind of represents. That's more through, I feel like, analysis that's come out after the fact and in retrospect, and I feel like more from what I've heard, Craven was just kind of going more for sort of human versus nature kind of thing, and how we are shaped by the experiences that we have, and it's like if we face, a barbaric situation, we in turn will turn barbaric because that's just human nature. And he was also bringing in like Greek myths and stuff like that, and Roman myths, and just talking about the human condition in general was what Craven was really interested in when he took on this kind of project, because you'll notice when we go through a lot of his movies, it's interesting how synonymous his name is with horror, because it's very clear when you really look at his movies that horror was not something that he really sought out. Horror is kind of something he fell into by accident, interestingly enough, and was just able to make a very expansive career out of it. But you can see when you look at his filmography, especially this one, that he always had more on his mind than just sort of scares and horror and stuff like that. But he was certainly able to channel his ideas through the genre and kind of bring that out. So, like I was saying, when you look at the differences between the two families here, and how different they feel, but also the similarities, which are kind of eerie when you really look at them. How each one has, the patriarch of sorts. One has the innocent. I guess you could say Ruby would be comparable to like the baby, as far as the one that feels like it didn't really have a choice in this scenario. I guess you could say the whole family didn't have a choice, because it started at, Jupiter and that matriarch of sorts, I guess we can call her, and the family just went from there. And how, I said, being born into this, the whole thing, is something else you could take a whole, allegorical path down. But setting that up and seeing how we were talking about, we were kind of leaving monsters behind at this point in horror, where we were showing humans and we were having human antagonists that felt like they had traits of monsters and kind of had the same sort of scare factor as monsters, but they were still human. So, like, when you look at the family here, when you look at, Jupiter and Pluto and Mars and Mercury and all them, it's interesting how much they're kind of built up as monsters. Like, we get little, snippets of Mercury kind of running around the gas station at the beginning, but they're quick enough to where we're not entirely sure what we're looking at right away, which is, pretty much the same point of view of the family seeing this. Another thing that's kind of creepy in the moment, where they're building up to the family without really showing them much, is there's this little sound effect that plays when we kind of get that shot of Mercury, like, going from one place to the other really quickly before it cuts away. And what I like about that is they play that sound when we see Mercury, and then there's two more times when they're talking to the father that runs the gas station, and they're getting out of the gas station finally, and he's warning them, he's saying, don't go out there, stay on the main road. You hear that sound effect a couple more times without Mercury being on screen. And I've always liked to think that whenever that sound effect plays, it means that Mercury's moving around even when we can't see him. there's also, like, the heavy breathing through the radio and stuff like that. Or when, like, Jupiter's just a voice in the dark that's, like, taunting Bob, I think he's taunting. And you get this sense that they're being built up to be something really monstrous and inhuman and like animals out in the desert. And then when we finally get a good look at them, they're very animalistic in a way, especially Mars. But it's like when we see Pluto for the first time, and obviously Michael Berryman has a very unconventional look. He had, like, birth defects and stuff like that, and he does kind of have, like, this sort of scary, intimidating look at first sight. And I think it helps a lot bringing him in as basically an unknown at the time. I feel like one of the only things he did before this was One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, where I don't even think he had lines. He was just kind of in the background of the scenes. And so to bring him in, and it's that first time we see him where we pan up from the door handle to his face, and it's like, part of you, they were really used him as a selling point with the original poster kind of being his face with the hills. But it's also like, once you get past the fact that, oh, he has a very unconventional look and he's kind of intimidating looking, it occurs to you, oh, these are just guys. Like, they're not like monsters, and they're not like, human-animal hybrids or anything. They're just people. Like, there's a whole, you could say there's maybe like this... There's the whole thing about it being a nuclear testing site and, potential inbreeding and stuff like that. But regardless, they're humans, and that's it. Like, one thing that I feel like makes that really stand out in an interesting way is thinking about the fact of, when you look at the way people can die in horror movies, especially if you're dealing with something that's not so human, or something that's more animalistic, you imagine, like, really sort of gory, elaborate deaths. Sort of like what Bob gets in the movie, where they crucify him, they set him on fire, they eat him. That's the kind of thing you think of. But then you look at Dee Wallace's death, and she gets shot. Which seems very straightforward, and obviously, being shot is a horrible thing that will end in death. But compared to the kind of deaths you expect to see in a movie like this, by the way they've been built up as these seemingly inhuman creatures before we actually see them, it's crazy how real the situation is. Where, like, it almost makes it scarier that she dies simply, but multiple characters simply die by being shot. And it's like, that really shows the realism of the situation and, like, grounding it in this reality. And that's where the horror is really coming from, is that people can watch this, from the safety of, their houses or bedrooms or whatever, but you can get the sense, when you really think about it, that you can put yourself in that situation. And then it becomes that age-old thing of having an audience be able to ask, like, what would I do in this situation? Would we be like Dee Wallace, and would we die very quickly, or would we be Doug, and would we go fucking insane and use their forces against them, and, like, go barbaric like they have, and use that against them? And would we be able to push ourselves to that point? Especially because it's not just how would we react with our lives in danger from these people. How would we react if the mother of my baby was just shot and killed by these people? And so him reacting off of all of this, whether it be self-defense or revenge or whatever it is, there's a lot that makes Doug that final image of the movie that he is, in that completely changed place where he has essentially become them in order to save the rest of the family from them. And this is, like I said, this is the point where you can see a lot of what Craven was going for with studying the human condition and stuff like that, while also making a pretty seriously scary movie on top of it. And I think another thing that helps too is, I don't know how many people would acknowledge this or think about this for a movie like this, because you would typically come to a movie called The Hills Have Eyes, which is known for being this, cult horror movie by a very famous horror director, and you're just probably here to see the carnage and the scares and all that. And honestly, a lot of times, horror movies, especially low-budget horror movies, tend to be associated with not great acting, which sort of sets up this not real vibe that a lot of horror movies have. A lot of horror movies have amazing performances, that can go under the radar because the genre is such its own star. And this, I feel like, is one of those where a lot of the realism comes into play through quite a few of the performances. And in these sort of individual moments, like when Bob is dead by this point and his body's just there, and the way Ethel just goes into complete denial. Like, usually in a horror movie, somebody will see a dead body, probably of a loved one, and just start screaming their head off, and that's basically their part until they themselves are killed. And to see Ethel just immediately go into that denial and say, that's not him, like, that's not Bob, that's not my Bob, is this very jarring reaction that you don't expect in a movie like this. I would assume especially in 77, audiences weren't expecting characters to react to death in a movie like this in that way. So that really stands out. And as anytime somebody is screaming their head off, it does feel less like, oh, you know, you're in a scary situation, now scream. It feels like hysteria. Like, it feels like characters are losing their minds, which is pretty amazing. And I talked about Martin Spear, who plays Doug, who plays that sort of transition into just normal dude to, you know, barbarian by the end, which is great. But the performance I feel like really stands out in this movie is Robert Houston, who plays Bobby. And we talked about that change, but as far as, you know, going from regular person that kind of comes from a privileged lifestyle to barbarian in the middle of nowhere committing brutal murder to save yourself and your family, there's something really sad about Bobby as it goes on, and it starts pretty early when Beauty is killed, and he decides that he's the only one that witnessed this, so he's gonna keep it to himself. And then there's this real sadness in the character that he conveys really well. And as it goes on, he continues, like, he's not one, like, he's able to sort of, you know, come up with plans as they start doing, like, the booby trap stuff, but he doesn't go full barbarian the way Doug does. And I love what Martin Spears doing also in regards to that. I definitely want to shout out the nuances, the surprising nuances that are in Houston's performance also as Bobby. So all of that, I think that's another thing too, though, about the human element and the human condition is that is the way it would be, where everybody kind of reacts differently. Where Ethel, you know, goes into denial. The other sister, whose name I've forgotten, I keep wanting to say Linda, but I don't know if that's right or not. She's, you know, going to hysterics and potentially losing her mind screaming. Bobby's just filled with sadness, but also his brain's kind of working overtime to try to find a way out of this. And Doug's just going beast mode, basically. And it's like, I love the fact that there's such a different array of the way the characters are reacting to this. And like I said, it all comes back to the same, it all comes full circle to the more you identify them as humans, the more grounded the situation is, which brings us back to the original goal of the movie. The scarier it is, the more real it feels. So there's so many things as far as that goes to appreciate this. But talking more about the family of cannibals, another character where we've talked about there's a particular place that Doug has to match when he goes barbaric at the end. And you look at it, what's very interesting is the sort of patriarch of the family, of course, is Jupiter. And he's obviously, I love the way they made him particularly recognizable by having where his face is busted from the tire iron from back when he was, you know, still basically a kid. And how he's basically grown up with this deformity that actually makes him look monstrous, even though he's completely human. And setting him up as, like, the sort of leader of the group, the sort of, what, like, he is to the cannibals what Bob was to the family. But Mars is the one that feels like the sort of main antagonist. He feels like the craziest one, the most animalistic one, even though he's not the patriarch or the leader necessarily. And I love antagonists that do that. Antagonists that kind of come out from behind the curtain, who is the actual main antagonist. And Lance Gordon, I think, is the actor's name. And this is a pretty terrifying performance. And once again, I feel like it really comes to light in the the sort of, centerpiece of the movie, which is this attack scene inside the trailer. And it's, like I said, where not only does it feel like a situation in a horror that could be real, but like I said, the way Mars looks very animalistic, and he's the scene with the bird, or the way the milk is coming out of his teeth, and it's like where it looks like somebody that's rabid, or an animal even that's rabid, and the fact that he's the last one left when we get to the climax makes, assuming you're not watching the alternate ending, I think that kind of switched up the order of things, but yeah, in the ending, I feel like most people know Mars is the last one that they have to take care of at the end, and that makes perfect sense to me. So I love the way they break that down, and each sort of individual family member has their place here and has their job here, much like it's its own society, essentially, because that's what they have here. And like I said, the fact that these other characters, the children, as they were basically born into this. So this is just, while it seems monstrous, this is just the life they've always known, and there's something weirdly tragic about that, despite the fact that these characters are terrifying. And I think that's another thing that really sort of sets this movie apart. But another thing is the setting itself, where it does look like, it's just sort of vast desert. But some of these rock structures and the way when you hear stories from the cast about the weather and how there wasn't a lot of acting involved as far as the weather just beating them down, where it was desert weather. During the day it was blistering, and then during the night it was freezing. And so you can feel like the characters are being beaten down by the setting on top of everything else that's happening, the traumatizing shit, and watching their family members get murdered and all that. And it's like you can feel the weight from the characters even before they really reach their full snapping points. And that's going to make the climax, when we get to it, all the more satisfying, which is great. I also love the little details like the spider, for instance, how the spider almost kind of feels like this omen, where it's like they get intruded on very early in the movie by just a spider, but it almost feels like this omen to how much worse intrusions can get as far as this goes, and the fact that they see the spider as such this terrifying thing in the moment, because if you're a person that doesn't know they're in a horror movie or doesn't know what's coming, you're going to think that's going to be the scariest thing you're going to see all day, as a spider of that size. And it's like the fact that is just, it's only going to get worse. It's going to only go downhill from here. It's this really great sort of foreshadowing kind of thing, it feels like. Also, talking about the scary things that this movie does, there's some stuff that I'm not even sure if it's meant to be scary for us. And it's just kind of the characters fucking around with each other, but there's that moment where Beauty's already been killed and the cannibals are talking amongst themselves, and I think it's the woman, the matriarch, is saying that it's beast howling and beast barking, I think, and she turns and says, it's the ghost of the dog you killed. And I don't know, even though we know that's not the case, and this movie isn't supernatural like that, I don't know, just something about that moment when you hear the howling in the distance, knowing that it's not a ghost dog, but I don't know, I almost feel like you can feel a fear from the cannibal's perspective in that sense, where they probably have lived on myths and ghost stories their whole lives, because what else are they doing out here besides eating people? So stuff like that's really interesting also. And like I said, I don't even know if it's intentionally that interesting, but I find it that interesting. There's also something this movie does a couple of times that is just the worst for me, and I mean that in the best way. It's absolutely a compliment. I always get really disturbed in horror movies when people treat corpses like they're still alive. There's just something so otherworldly, fucked up, and disturbing about that. So we get the one scene where Jupiter is monologuing, and for a minute we don't really know who he's monologuing to, and then we cut to Bob's corpse right before he crucifies and burns it. And the fact that he's been having this whole conversation with this body that's just not there. Like, I think that's the thing, is, like, it really... When corpses are treated like they're still alive in horror movies, it only further highlights how gone a person is when they're dead. And the fact that we saw Bob as this human character, he has a family, we know he's been married to Ethel for however long it's been, and it's like, we feel like we can see, even though Bob's not a likable character by any means, we can see an entire life when we look at him. And to think, and there's just something so disturbing also about, whenever, like, old people are killed in horror movies, it's always really disturbing to me, because it's like, imagine living your whole life, and your whole life is pretty inconsequential, but content, because you appear to have reached kind of all your goals in life, and now you're just a senior citizen that's relaxing, and then you're killed in the ways that some old people have been killed in horror movies. Particularly, what's done to Bob here is something that is so unthinkable, and it's like I said, even if Bob was an unlikable character, still, just seeing somebody where you get a sense of what their entire life basically was, just in a few lines of dialogue, and then to see no life in this body. And I can imagine if some people can't take it seriously because the body's so clearly, fake looking, but I don't, just still, the more lifelessness there is to that body, the more scary I feel like the scene is. And then there's the second moment where Ethel has also died, and they have to use her body as bait. And it's like this, knowing that it's their mother, too, is just so, there's just this extra level of disturbing. And it's like, and I can even see people in the 70s probably, like, being outraged by how disturbing it is, but that's... If I made a movie that was a horror movie intended to be disturbing, and people came to me and they were speaking about how disturbed they were as a negative, I would absolutely take that as a compliment. The more negative they were about how disturbed they felt, the more I would take it as a compliment, honestly. And I can only assume Craven had to have done the same, facing criticisms like that, after having made a movie like this. And that's all the different ways it's effective in that sense, and just praise for Craven in general. It's really interesting to listen to the cast and the crew, and how it was like, how Craven was apparently a shy guy. I don't know how long that went through his career, but at least back then when he was making this movie, the cast and crew were almost concerned that he was too shy of a guy, especially to make a movie like this. But the thing that kept them holding on, and the thing that really gave them belief in him and faith in him, was that he clearly had a vision, and he made that clear enough, where it's like, can he do this? I don't know, but the vision is clear enough, and he's passionate about it enough, that the cast and crew were like, whatever he comes up, let's just do it. And when that happens, when you just kind of have faith in the person who has the vision and the person making it, you can get stuff like this, where you can imagine, people not having faith in it at first, but sometimes you just have to trust somebody's vision, especially if they've already shown that they have talent. Because we've hit a lot of similar notes here that we hit with Last House on the Left as well. You can see that kind of carrying over here, and him bringing the talent that he showed there over to this, and elevating it, and sort of elevating the terror and all that. Believe it or not. But that's how I feel about this. What it comes down to is Craven has always had a lot more to say than just, his scares and stuff like that. But the way he channels what he wants to talk about, and, the human condition, and, the trials and tribulations that people go through and humans go through, oftentimes, if it was out of their control, if they were born into it, it feels like it's really being explored in this movie. So you can really get a sense of that early on, and how ultimately that'll carry on through his career, which obviously we're going to continue to talk about at great length over these next 7 days. So I guess I can touch on the sequel briefly. I don't feel like there's a whole lot to say about it, because it's not a whole lot of movie. it did the whole thing. It did the Silent Night, Deadly Night 2 thing, where there's not really a lot of movie here, so it's basically a clip show, where we just have a lot of flashbacks to the previous movie, and they play clips from the previous movie. And it's mostly characters recapping what happened. It's like the opening scenes of like the first two Friday the 13th when they're saying, "Oh, here's the backstory," and they basically play the first movie again. And it even got to a point to where there is a flashback scene that is basically the thing that The Hills Have Eyes Part 2 is most known for, I feel like, where Beast has a flashback, the dog has a flashback. And the fact that this movie almost came single-handedly notorious for this one moment that's that fucking ridiculous. Yeah, there's that whole thing. But talking about things sort of being retreaded and just reusing things, you'll notice that Harry Manfredini is the composer for this, and I had to look it up because the last time I was watching The Hills Have Eyes Part 2, I was thinking, like, this sounds so much like they lifted the Friday the 13th score. Like, it's not. It doesn't just feel like a rip-off of the Friday the 13th score. It feels like they're using the Friday the 13th score. And that's pretty much what it is. Like, they hired him, but it seemed like it was more to get the permission to use his music, his pre-existing music, rather than for him to create much of any original material for the movie. But, yeah, there's also... We were talking about the really good performances in this and the surprisingly nuanced performances in the first movie. So, naturally, this one the sequel is littered with awful, terrible, completely unnatural performances. Especially that actress playing Cass, the blind girl, who I don't really think did much of she was like the wife of a director, I think, and that's basically, you can just imagine, she was probably shoehorned into this for one reason or another. So... that's a real downside to this. I actually think there was an interesting idea in Part 2. This idea of having Ruby having integrated herself into society, and then just as she's kind of starting to have a normal life, she comes full circle and finds her way back here. And that's an interesting idea, but they don't really do any profound things with it, and they give her one of the lamest, most anticlimactic fucking death scenes maybe ever that makes you question why they even had a Ruby storyline to begin with. I don't know what the fuck that was, but yeah. And talking about the threats here, and if there's any scary factor whatsoever, there isn't. Pluto's returned. I guess he didn't really get a definitive death, so it's not completely egregious they would bring Pluto back, I guess. Not to mention they were using Michael Berryman's face for so much of the advertising in the first movie. Why not, bring him back to do that again? But this whole thing of him on the dirt bike and them chasing him, there's nothing scary going on here, there's nothing intimidating going on here. It just the whole dirt bike chase just makes Pluto seem mildly annoying. Like a minor inconvenience. So he's a nuisance. That's all Pluto is in this movie, is a nuisance. And so there's no horror to be found in that. It does make sense. When you look at this and you're like, how is this movie credited to Craven? It was the whole thing of, this came out, and then he had a couple more things, and then Nightmare on Elm Street happened, and Nightmare on Elm Street obviously made him Wes Craven. So then they were like, oh, why don't we do, The Hills Have Eyes again? Do a sequel to that now that you're big and you can make us money. Let's do that. So he was basically forced into it and ultimately disowned it. He basically did it so he could make money to do the things he cared about and take care of himself. So that's basically it's one of those movies that was shamelessly all for the money. But shamelessly as far as, like, the studio goes. But Craven, made sure to, disown the movie, and the fact that it was basically incomplete anyway, and the fact that it basically serves as a clip show is because the runtime was that low. They needed a feature-length movie. And so it's basically an incomplete movie. It's very, very surprising to me that it also managed to get the Arrow Blu-ray treatment. I don't know who thought that was worthwhile, but maybe for, completion's sake, if you want like a full Craven collection, why not have the highest quality of all the ones you can get? But that's certainly surprising. And then to just touch on the remake really quick, which I think probably surprised a lot of people in quality. And because it was in a place where it was 2006, I believe, so we were already kind of in that place of torture porn was kind of taking over. We were like post-Saw and post-Hostel and stuff like that. So yeah, it did feel like it was, especially like the opening scene, it was just going to kind of go out of its way to be as gory and gross and grimy and in your face as possible, which was basically the mid-2000s style of accomplishing something in the same way that Craven was doing in the 70s, with less of the effort. But with that said, the movie is like really patiently paced for what it is, and for that time period where it was like, oh, let's get out all the gore, and let's put everything in the audience face as much as possible. It surprisingly takes its time and does put a lot of the focus on the characters at the start and seem to really care about capturing Craven's vibe from the original movie as much as it could. Like, it does feel like the makeup is really good. There are some cases where it kind of felt like the scare factor was maybe a little too reliant on the makeup, but still, that doesn't take away from the quality of the makeup and the fact that the movie still finds ways to get under your skin that do go beyond that. But I would say it's still maybe a little too reliant on it. But apart from that, to talk about especially moments where the movie gets under your skin, one thing I feel like was probably going to make or break the movie and really show what exactly it cared about, if it was going to be about making a good movie and a good remake, or if it was just going to be how gnarly and disturbing and gross can we be. Disturbing in the bad sense, not in the good sense, the way the original movie is. How was this attack scene going to play out? And they did the attack scene shockingly well in the remake. Like, it's one of those cases where you would expect it, especially by the opening scenes. You expect them to go way too extreme and maybe way too far with it, and probably come off like they're trying too hard also. But their version of the attack scene is just the right amount of intense for a horror movie coming out when it did amongst the other movies that were coming out around it. That was kind of setting the tone for horror for this era. And that's where I feel like the movie really, I would say saves itself, but it's like, for the most part, it does a good job of not getting too wrapped up in what would have essentially could have been its downfall of what basically the sequel to this one did, where it was all about just trying to be as, vulgar and whatever, and it's like and just completely in poor taste. And I know it's weird to think about The Hills Have Eyes, either version, and say they're done in good taste, but there is a way. There is a difference between a movie that knows how to handle its material in a surprisingly restrained way, even though it may seem like a movie that's not restrained at all. If you see enough horror and you can make the comparisons, you understand how this actually feels like it's actually restrained in a good way, even though it may not look like it on the surface at all. And so especially that opening scene, which is pretty unnecessary, but like I said, 2006 horror, it's to be expected, and I'm glad that they held back on it. Like, they introduced it to you and they're like, hey, this is the tone. But interestingly enough, it's kind of not really the tone that much. The movie's actually better than it leads you to believe in the opening scene, so that's great. And the whole idea of having the sort of climax in like the test site town was a really good addition. It does a lot of things also like that, where like the additions that it made they weren't prolonging the story. They were actually just sort of using the original movie as stepping stones for, well, if we want to do what the original movie did, we can expand this a little like this. Like, one thing that might seem like it goes too much into it or indulges too much is the fact that as soon as Doug goes full barbarian at the end of the original movie, the movie just ends. and we just get the vibe of, oh, they were met with their own power. This movie does end with the Doug character basically going on a full killing spree of the people in this test site. The people that are much more, they went for the mutation route, so it does feel like they were making more of a monster movie. But still, it matched the vibes pretty well, which is just really surprising. It continues to be surprising whenever I come back to it. It's always like, I always get that vibe where I'm like, I don't know if I want to watch the remake. And then whenever I do, I'm like, I don't know why I don't watch this more often. It's surprisingly good. It's almost shockingly good and well done. And does a complete service to the original movie. So that's great. And also keeping the vibe of having the end credits over a red background is just a nice touch. So, yeah. So that's basically how I take to The Hills Have Eyes. Like I said, the sequel to the remake is just not even worth talking about. I saw it right when it came out on DVD back in 2007, and I just have no intentions of ever seeing it again, quite honestly. Maybe morbid curiosity will get the better of me in another 10 years or something, but I just fuck that movie. So, that's this. So this is our first day of the week for Wes Craven week, and yeah, we're just going to keep doing this for every day this week. So keep coming back for that, and until then, that's it.